The Late Middle Ages. A late medieval period was the period of European history generally comprising the 14th and 15th centuries. The Late Middle Ages followed the High Middle Ages and preceded the onset of the early modern era. Around 1300, centuries of prosperity and growth in Europe came to a halt. A series of famines and plagues, including the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 and the Black Death, reduced the population to around half of what it was before the calamities. Along with depopulation came social unrest and endemic warfare. France and England experienced serious peasant uprisings, such as the Jacquerie and the Peasants' Revolt, as well as over a century of intermittent conflict in the 100 Years' War. To add to the many problems of the period, the unity of the Catholic Church was shattered by the Western Schism. Collectively, these events are sometimes called the crisis of the Late Middle Ages. Despite these crises, the 14th century was also a time of great progress in the arts and sciences. Following a renewed interest in ancient Greek and Roman texts that took root in the High Middle Ages, the Italian Renaissance began. The absorption of Latin texts had started before the Renaissance of the 12th century through contact with Arabs during the Crusades, but the availability of important Greek texts accelerated with the capture of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks. When many Byzantine scholars had to seek refuge in the West, particularly Italy, combined with this influx of classical ideas was the invention of printing, which facilitated dissemination of the printed word and democratized learning. These two things would later lead to the Protestant Reformation. Toward the end of the period, an era of discovery began. The rise of the Ottoman Empire, culminating in the fall of Constantinople in 1453, eroded the last remnants of the Byzantine Empire and cut off trading possibilities with the East. Europeans were forced to seek new trading routes, leading to the expedition of Columbus to the Americas in 1492, and Vasco da Gama's circumnavigation of India and Africa in 1498. The discoveries strengthened the economy and power of European nations. The changes brought about by these developments have led many scholars to view this period as the end of the Middle Ages and beginning of modern history in early modern Europe. However, the division is somewhat artificial, since ancient learning was never entirely absent from European society. As a result, there was developmental continuity between the ancient age and the modern age. Some historians, particularly in Italy, prefer not to speak of the late Middle Ages at all, but rather see the high period of the Middle Ages transitioning to the Renaissance and the modern era. Historiography and Periodization. The term Late Middle Ages refers to one of the three periods of the Middle Ages, along with the Early Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages. Leonardo Bruni was the first historian to use tripartite periodization in his History of the Florentine People. Flavio Biondo used a similar framework in Decades of History from the Deterioration of the Roman Empire. Tripartite periodization became standard after the German historian Christoph Cellarius published Universal History divided into an ancient, medieval, and new period. For 18th century historians studying the 14th and 15th centuries, the central theme was the Renaissance, with its rediscovery of ancient learning and the emergence of an individual spirit. The heart of this rediscovery lies in Italy, where, in the words of Jacob Burckhardt, man became a spiritual individual and recognized himself as such. This proposition was later challenged, and it was argued that the 12th century was a period of greater cultural achievement, as economic and demographic methods were applied to the study of history. The trend was increasingly to see the late Middle Ages as a period of recession and crisis. Belgian historian Henry Perrin continued the subdivision of early, high, and late Middle Ages in the years around World War I. Yet it was his Dutch colleague, Johan Huizinga, who was primarily responsible for popularizing the pessimistic view of the late Middle Ages, with his book The Autumn of the Middle Ages. To Huizinga, whose research focused on France and the Low Countries rather than Italy, despair and decline were the main themes, not rebirth. Modern historiography on the period has reached a consensus between the two extremes of innovation and crisis. It is now acknowledged that conditions were vastly different north and south of the Alps, and late Middle Ages is often avoided entirely within Italian historiography. The term Renaissance is still considered useful for describing certain intellectual, cultural, or artistic developments, but not as the defining feature of an entire European historical epoch. The period from the early 14th century up until, and sometimes including, the 16th century, is rather seen as characterized by other trends: demographic and economic decline followed by recovery, the end of Western religious unity and the subsequent emergence of the nation-state, and the expansion of European influence onto the rest of the world. History. The limits of Christian Europe were still being defined in the 14th and 15th centuries, while the Grand Duchy of Moscow was beginning to repel the Mongols, and the Iberian kingdoms completed the reconquest of the peninsula and turned their attention outwards. The Balkans fell under the dominance of the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, the remaining nations of the continent were locked in almost constant international or internal conflict. The situation gradually led to the consolidation of central authority and the emergence of the nation-state. The financial demands of war necessitated higher levels of taxation, resulting in the emergence of representative bodies, most notably the English Parliament. The growth of secular authority was further aided by the decline of the papacy with the Western Schism and the coming of the Protestant Reformation. Northern Europe. Main articles: Denmark, Norway, Sweden. After the failed union of Sweden and Norway of 1319 to 1365, the Pan-Scandinavian Kalmar Union was instituted in 1397. The Swedes were reluctant members of the Danish-dominated Union from the start. In an attempt to subdue the Swedes, King Christian II of Denmark had large numbers of the Swedish aristocracy killed in the Stockholm bloodbath of 1520. Yet this measure only led to further hostilities, and Sweden broke away for good in 1523. Norway, on the other hand, became an inferior party of the Union and remained united with Denmark until 1814. Iceland benefited from its relative isolation and was the last Scandinavian country to be struck by the Black Death. Meanwhile, the Norse colony in Greenland died out, probably under extreme weather conditions in the 15th century. These conditions might have been the effect of the Little Ice Age. Northwest Europe. The death of Alexander III of Scotland in 1286 threw the country into a succession crisis, and the English King Edward I was brought in to arbitrate. Edward claimed overlordship over Scotland, leading to the Wars of Scottish Independence. The English were eventually defeated, and the Scots were able to develop a stronger state under the Stuarts. From 1337, England's attention was largely directed towards France in the 100 Years' War. Henry V's victory at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 briefly paved the way for a unification of the two kingdoms. But his son Henry VI soon squandered all previous gains. The loss of France led to discontent at home. Soon after the end of the war in 1453, the dynastic struggles of the Wars of the Roses began, involving the rival dynasties of the House of Lancaster and House of York. The war ended in the accession of Henry VII of the Tudor family, who continued the work started by the Yorkist kings of building a strong, centralized monarchy. While England's attention was thus directed elsewhere, the Hiberno-Norman lords in Ireland were becoming gradually more assimilated into Irish society, and the island was allowed to develop virtual independence under English overlordship. Western Europe. Main articles: France, Burgundy, Burgundian Netherlands. The French House of Valois, which followed the House of Capet in 1328, was at its outset marginalized in its own country, first by the English invading forces of the Hundred Years' War, and later by the powerful Duchy of Burgundy. The emergence of Joan of Arc as a military leader changed the course of war in favor of the French, and the initiative was carried further by King Louis XI. Meanwhile, Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, met resistance in his attempts to consolidate his possessions, particularly from the Swiss Confederation formed in 1291. When Charles was killed in the Burgundian Wars at the Battle of Nancy in 1477, the Duchy of Burgundy was reclaimed by France. At the same time, the County of Burgundy and the wealthy Burgundian Netherlands came into the Holy Roman Empire under Habsburg control, setting up conflict for centuries to come. Central Europe. Main articles: Germany, Bohemia, Hungary, Poland, Lithuania. Bohemia prospered in the 14th century, and the Golden Bull of 1356 made the King of Bohemia first among the imperial electors, but the Hussite Revolution threw the country into crisis. The Holy Roman Empire passed to the Habsburgs in 1438, where it remained until its dissolution in 1806. Yet in spite of the extensive territories held by the Habsburgs, the empire itself remained fragmented, and much real power and influence lay with the individual principalities. In addition, financial institutions, such as the Hanseatic League and the Fugger family, held great power on both economic and political levels. The Kingdom of Hungary experienced a golden age during the 14th century, in particular the reigns of the Angevin kings Charles Robert and his son Louis the Great were marked by success. The country grew wealthy as the main European supplier of gold and silver. Louis the Great led successful campaigns from Lithuania to southern Italy, and from Poland to northern Greece. He had the greatest military potential of the 14th century with his enormous armies. Meanwhile, Poland's attention was turned eastwards, as the union with Lithuania created an enormous entity in the region. The union and the conversion of Lithuania also marked the end of paganism in Europe. Louis did not leave a son as heir after his death in 1382. Instead, he named as his heir the young Prince Sigismund of Luxembourg, who was 11 years old. The Hungarian nobility did not accept his claim, and the result was an internal war. Sigismund eventually achieved total control of Hungary and established his court in Buda and Visegrad. Both palaces were rebuilt and improved, and were considered the richest of the time in Europe. Inheriting the throne of Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire, Sigismund continued conducting his politics from Hungary, but he was kept busy fighting the Hussites and the Ottoman Empire, which was becoming a menace to Europe in the beginning of the 15th century. The King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary led the largest army of mercenaries of the time, the Black Army of Hungary, which he used to conquer Bohemia and Austria and to fight the Ottoman Empire. However, the glory of the kingdom ended in the early 16th century, when the King Louis II of Hungary was killed in the Battle of Mohacs in 1526 against the Ottoman Empire. Hungary then fell into a serious crisis and was invaded, ending its significance in Central Europe during the medieval era. Eastern Europe, the state of Kiev and Rus fell during the 13th century in the Mongol invasion. The Grand Duchy of Moscow rose in power thereafter, winning a great victory against the Golden Horde at the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380. The victory did not end Tatar rule in the region, however, and its immediate beneficiary was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which extended its influence eastwards. Under the reign of Ivan the Great, Moscow became a major regional power, and the annexation of the vast Republic of Novgorod in 1478 laid the foundations for a Russian national state. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Russian princes started to see themselves as the heirs of the Byzantine Empire. They eventually took on the imperial title of Tsar, and Moscow was described as the Third Rome. Southeast Europe. Main articles: Byzantine Empire, Bulgaria, Serbia, Albania. The Byzantine Empire had for a long time dominated the Eastern Mediterranean in politics and culture. By the 14th century, however, it had almost entirely collapsed into a tributary state of the Ottoman Empire, centered on the city of Constantinople and a few enclaves in Greece. With the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Byzantine Empire was permanently extinguished. The Bulgarian Empire was in decline by the 14th century, and the ascendancy of Serbia was marked by the Serbian victory over the Bulgarians in the Battle of Velbajde in 1330. By 1346, the Serbian king Stefan Dušan had been proclaimed emperor, yet Serbian dominance was short-lived. The Serbian army led by the Lazar Abljefanović was defeated by the Ottomans at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, where most of the Serbian nobility was killed and the south of the country came under Ottoman occupation, as much of southern Bulgaria had become Ottoman territory in 1371. Northern remnants of Bulgaria were finally conquered by 1396. Serbia fell in 1459, Bosnia in 1463, and Albania was finally subordinated in 1479, only a few years after the death of Skanderbeg. Belgrade, an Hungarian domain at the time, was the last large Balkan city to fall under Ottoman rule, in 1521. By the end of the medieval period, the entire Balkan peninsula was annexed by, or became vassal to, the Ottomans. Southwest Europe. Main articles: Italy, Crown of Aragon, Spain, Portugal. Avignon was the seat of the papacy from 1309 to 1376. With the return of the Pope to Rome in 1378, the papal state developed into a major secular power, culminating in the morally corrupt papacy of Alexander VI. Florence grew to prominence amongst the Italian city-states through financial business, and the dominant Medici family became important promoters of the Renaissance through the patronage of the arts. Other city-states in northern Italy also expanded their territories and consolidated the power, primarily Milan and Venice. The War of the Sicilian Vespers had by the early 14th century divided southern Italy into an Aragon kingdom of Sicily and an Anjou kingdom of Naples. In 1442, the two kingdoms were effectively united under Aragonese control. The 1469 marriage of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon and the 1479 death of John II of Aragon led to the creation of modern-day Spain. In 1492, Granada was captured from the Moors, thereby completing the Reconquista. Portugal had during the 15th century, particularly under Henry the Navigator, gradually explored the coast of Africa, and in 1498, the Vasco da Gama found the sea route to India. The Spanish monarchs met the Portuguese challenge by financing the expedition of Christopher Columbus to find a western sea route to India, leading to the discovery of the Americas in 1492. Late medieval European society. Around 1300 to 1350, the medieval warm period gave way to the Little Ice Age. The colder climate resulted in agricultural crises, the first of which is known as the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. The demographic consequences of this famine, however, were not as severe as the plagues that occurred later in the century, particularly the Black Death. Estimates of the death rate caused by this epidemic range from 1/3 to as much as 60%. By around 1420, the accumulated effect of recurring plagues and famines had reduced the population of Europe to perhaps no more than 1/3 of what it was a century earlier. The effects of natural disasters were exacerbated by armed conflicts. This was particularly the case in France during the 100 Years' War. As the European population was severely reduced, land became more plentiful for the survivors, and labor consequently more expensive. Attempts by landowners to forcibly reduce wages, such as the English 1351 Statute of Labourers, were doomed to fail. These efforts resulted in nothing more than fostering resentment among the peasantry, leading to rebellions such as the French Jacquerie in 1358 and the English Peasants' Revolt in 1381. The long-term effect was the virtual end of serfdom in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, on the other hand, landowners were able to exploit the situation to force the peasantry into even more repressive bondage. The upheavals caused by the Black Death left certain minority groups particularly vulnerable, especially the Jews, who were often blamed for the calamities. Anti-Jewish pogroms were carried out all over Europe. In February 1349, 2,000 Jews were murdered in Strasbourg. States were also guilty of discrimination against the Jews. Monarchs gave in to the demands of the people, and the Jews were expelled from England in 1290, from France in 1306, from Spain in 1492, and from Portugal in 1497. While the Jews were suffering persecution, one group that probably experienced increased empowerment in the late Middle Ages was women. The great social changes of the period opened up new possibilities for women in the fields of commerce, learning and religion. Yet at the same time, women were also vulnerable to incrimination and persecution as belief in witchcraft increased. Up until the mid-14th century, Europe had experienced steadily increasing urbanization. Cities were also decimated by the Black Death, but the role of urban areas as centers of learning, commerce and government ensured continued growth. By 1500, Venice, Milan, Naples, Paris and Constantinople each probably had more than 100,000 inhabitants. 22 other cities were larger than 40,000. Most of these were in Italy and the Iberian Peninsula, but there were also some in France, the Empire, the Low Countries, plus London in England. Military history. Through battles such as Courtrai, Bannockburn, and Morgarten, it became clear to the great territorial princes of Europe that the military advantage of the feudal cavalry was lost, and that a well-equipped infantry was preferable. Through the Welsh Wars, the English became acquainted with and adopted the highly efficient longbow. Once properly managed, this weapon gave them a great advantage over the French in the 100 Years' War. The introduction of gunpowder affected the conduct of war significantly. Though employed by the English as early as the Battle of Crèvecoeur in 1346, firearms initially had little effect in the field of battle. It was through the use of cannons as siege weapons that major change was brought about. The new methods would eventually change the architectural structure of fortifications. Changes also took place within the recruitment and composition of armies. The use of the national or feudal levy was gradually replaced by paid troops of domestic retinues of foreign mercenaries. The practice was associated with Edward III of England and the condottieri of the Italian city-states. All over Europe, Swiss soldiers were in particularly high demand. At the same time, the period also saw the emergence of the first permanent armies. It was in Valois, France, under the heavy demands of the 100 Years' War, that the armed forces gradually assumed a permanent nature. Parallel to the military developments emerged also a constantly more elaborate chivalric code of conduct for the warrior class. This newfound ethos can be seen as a response to the diminishing military role of the aristocracy, and gradually it became almost entirely detached from its military origin. The spirit of chivalry was given expression through the new type of chivalric orders. The first of these was the Order of St. George, founded by Charles I of Hungary in 1325, while the best known was probably the English Order of the Garter, founded by Edward III in 1348. Christian conflict and reform. The Papal Schism, the French crown's increasing dominance over the papacy, culminated in the transference of the Holy See to Avignon in 1309. When the Pope returned to Rome in 1377, this led to the election of different popes in Avignon and Rome, resulting in the Papal Schism. The schism divided Europe along political lines, while France, her ally Scotland and the Spanish kingdoms supported the Avignon papacy. France's enemy England stood behind the Pope in Rome, together with Portugal, Scandinavia and most of the German princes. At the Council of Constance, the papacy was once more united in Rome. Even though the unity of the Western Church was to last for another 100 years, and though the papacy was to experience greater material prosperity than ever before, the Great Schism had done irreparable damage. The internal struggles within the Church had impaired her claim to universal rule, and promoted anti-clericalism among the people and the rulers, paving the way for reform movements. Protestant Reformation. Though many of the events were outside the traditional time period of the Middle Ages, the end of the unity of the Western Church was one of the distinguishing characteristics of the medieval period. The Catholic Church had long fought against heretic movements, but during the late Middle Ages, it started to experience demands for reform from within. The first of these came from Oxford Professor John Wycliffe in England. Wycliffe held that the Bible should be the only authority in religious questions, and he spoke out against transubstantiation, celibacy and indulgences. In spite of influential supporters among the English aristocracy, such as John of Gaunt, the movement was not allowed to survive. Though Wycliffe himself was left unmolested, his supporters, the Lollards, were eventually suppressed in England. The marriage of Richard II of England to Anne of Bohemia established contacts between the two nations and brought Lollard ideas to her homeland. The teachings of the Czech priest Jan Hus were based on those of John Wycliffe, yet his followers, the Hussites, were to have a much greater political impact than the Lollards. Hus gained a great following in Bohemia, and in 1414, he was requested to appear at the Council of Constance to defend his cause. When he was burned as a heretic in 1415, it caused a popular uprising in the Czech lands. The subsequent Hussite wars fell apart due to internal quarrels and did not result in religious or national independence for the Czechs, but both the Catholic Church and the German element within the country were weakened. Martin Luther, a German monk, started the German Reformation by posting 95 theses on the castle church of Wittenberg on October 31, 1517. The immediate provocation spurring this act was Pope Leo X's renewal of the indulgence for the building of the new St. Peter's Basilica in 1514. Luther was challenged to recant his heresy at the Diet of Worms in 1521. When he refused, he was placed under the ban of the empire by Charles V. Receiving the protection of Frederick the Wise, he was then able to translate the Bible into German. To many secular rulers, the Protestant Reformation was a welcome opportunity to expand wealth and influence. The Catholic Church met the challenges of the reforming movements with what has been called the Catholic Reformation, or Counter-Reformation. Europe became split into northern Protestant and southern Catholic parts, resulting in the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries.